Hello, it's Beth from Ruth Stitchery and ruthstitchery.com. And a couple of weeks ago, we did a video about how to calculate how much yardage you need to buy for your binding. So I had shown you this table runner. I got my binding sewn on. But one of the other things we get asked quite a bit is, how do you finish off connecting your binding so that you don't get a lot of fabric bulk in your binding? And so we thought we would do a quick video today to show you how I do it. There's obviously several different ways to do this. I'm going to show you how I do it, how I have figured out works for me so I don't get a twist in my binding. So I'm going to show you that. So here's the table runner. I always tend to start, no matter what I'm sewing my binding on, I always tend to start on one of the longer edges and kind of right in the middle. So I just chose the longer side of the table runner and started my binding leaving, this is about an 8 to 10 inch tail. So I'm going to leave a tail and I'll start stitching here, and I do back stitch on this. You know, usually I tell people in quilting there's no need to back stitch anything. This is the only time that I back stitch. Well, actually there's two. There's when I'm putting the binding on and when I'm leaving an opening to turn something inside out on a bag. I will back stitch just so those stitches don't come out. So I'll put just a couple little back stitches here where I've started. I sew it around, and then I'm coming back down the large side, and you can see that I leave about 18 to 20 inches open here. So I've got this big long tail. I also backstitch here at the end, and that's just because I'm going to be messing with this a little bit and I don't want those stitches to come out. So I will backstitch at the front and the end, and I leave about a 18 to 20 inch opening here so that I can work with the quilt and not be tugging at it when I go to my machine. Okay, so I have found that the easiest way for me to do this is I take my quilt to my cutting table with the quilt hanging down in front of me with the side that I'm about to start to mess with at the top. So if it's a larger quilt, I'll have a large quilt hanging down, you know, in front of me at my cut table. But as long as I have my clear working space right here where I'm trying to trim my binding, this is what kind of works for me. So here is the tail that I started with, and the first thing I do is just lay that flat. If I had left this much longer, I would maybe trim it so that it ended up somewhere here in the middle. But I'm going to lay that flat on my quilt and right along the edge. And then I'm going to be trimming this big long tail. So how much do you trim? You always go by the width of your binding. So depending on how wide you like your binding strip is the measurement you're going to go by. So what I do, I like 2 1/4. So I will take a ruler and I lay my ruler down so that whatever that measurement is, so my 2 1/4 is right at the edge or the end of this binding strip. So I'm 2 1/4 here. Then I will take this second tail and I will lay that down, and I'm basically now looking at the edge of this ruler so that this space between the undertail and this top tail is 2 1/4. So I'm going to just take any kind of marking pen, I've just got a pencil here, and I'm going to mark a line across the top tail on this binding, and then I'm going to leave it folded, come over to my cutting mat, I'm going to lay my ruler down, line it up with the line I just drew, and then I can cut that tail off. So now I know that this overlap right here is the same as the width of my binding. So now I have to figure out, how am I going to connect this, right? So I've got these two tails, and both of them have raw edge here across the top. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to stick my fingers inside and I'm just going to open that up. Again, I'm just walking you through how I do this to not get the binding all twisted. And so the way that I have always remembered how to do this is I've now got both sides right side up. I remember left over right and right side up. So I'm going to leave this side with the fabric, the right side of the fabric up. I'm going to take this left side and it's going to go down. So I know I'm going to go left over right. I'm going to line up these edges. This is why you want that space in between so you can kind of scrunch up your quilt and not have any pull on this binding. So I'm going to get this all lined up and I'm going to put, I usually put 2 pins. I know I'm going to be stitching a diagonal seam across here. So I usually will put 2 pins, leaving that diagonal middle open. So now I've got it pinned, and then I will lay this back down onto my cut table. I'm going to take my ruler. I'm going to line my 45-degree line up against the edge of this top strip. And that way I know that now this is going to give me a 45-degree line across my binding. So I've got a stitch line here that's ready to go. I'm all pinned and I can take this to my machine. Okay, so I'm at my machine. I'm got my binding pinned, and you can see that I've kind of got my quilt bunched up, which is why I like to have quite a bit of space here so that I can sort of bunch the quilt up. I can set my binding kind of out of the way, and then there's no drag when I'm trying to do this last little stitch. So I've got my 2 binding pieces lined up, my pins on either side. I've got my line drawn across, and then I'm going to go ahead and stitch on that line. Okay, so I've stitched across. Now we're going to take our pins out. We're going to go back to the cutting table and we'll see how I did. Okay, so I'm back at the cutting table. You can see I've taken my pins out. I've got that seam sewn. And the first thing I always do, even though I'm pretty confident now that it's going to be all good, before I trim this, I go ahead and kind of let it go and make sure that when I fold this, that it is actually laying flat and it's not twisted around. So I always double check that before I do this last trim. So you can see I'm gonna lay flat. So now I'm going to take this binding and I just need to trim this, and I'm gonna leave a 1/4 inch just like we normally would. So I will take my ruler, I'm gonna lay this down across my stitch line right on the 1/4 inch line, and then I can trim this off. And there I've got my seam allowance so that when I pull this, I usually just give this a really good finger press. I mean, you certainly can take it back to the iron if you would like, but I usually just give it a really good finger press so that now I can lay it and it's all flat. There's no bulk across my binding. And then I'll take this back to my machine. I usually start maybe 1/2 inch or so on top of the stitching where I finished here, and I will go down and I will finish about 1/2 inch over the stitching that I started with. And then my binding is ready to flip over to the back, and I will hand stitch that down. Okay, so I've got it all stitched on. I've gone back, I've stitched across that edge that was open, And now I'm getting ready to flip it to the back, and I like to hand stitch. If I were gonna machine stitch this, I would have stitched my binding onto the back, rolled it to the front, and machine stitched it on the front of my quilt. But one of the other tips I wanted to share is when I get to this point, regardless of whether I'm gonna machine stitch the last part or hand stitch it, I like to take my quilt to the iron, and I like to iron this binding flat all the way around. So I will pop the corners, and I will give that seam a really good press all the way around. And so that way, this is flat like this, and then I'm ready to start pinning it to the back. Or what I have found that I love to use are the little mini clips. Some people call these binding clips, and I like to pin around. I usually leave a little bit of space, that way I'm not pulling as many clips off, but I'll go ahead typically and pin one side, and I will hand stitch it, then I'll pin the next side or clip the next side, and then I'll keep going until I go all the way around. It makes the binding lay super nice and flat. So hopefully these little tips were helpful. We get that question a lot, how do you get your binding to lay so flat all the way around? So hopefully this was helpful, and thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to share our videos.